We need to talk about a miscalculation, not a small one, not the kind you brush off in a press briefing, the kind that rewrites maps. For months, the narrative was simple. Donald Trump was going to fix trade. He was going to stand up to the cheaters. He was going to swing the hammer, 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, and watch the neighbors to the north fold like a lawn chair. It was a script we had seen before. Loud threats, big numbers, rally speeches packed with fire, social media posts accusing Canada of cheating, of exploiting American workers. The usual playbook. Behind closed doors, the confidence was absolute. Push Canada hard enough, they said, and they break. Their economy is too dependent on the United States to survive without it. Mark Carney would come crawling back to the negotiating table, desperate, cornered, ready to make a deal. That kind of confidence, as some people call it strategy, others call it something else entirely, delusion. Because what happened next didn't fit the script, not even close. Mark Carney didn't lash out. He didn't panic. He didn't fire back with emotional threats or rushed retaliation. In fact, he barely reacted at all. And right there, that was the first warning sign, the kind most people miss. Because when your opponent stays quiet, when they refuse to engage, it usually means one of two things. Either they're too weak to respond or they're preparing something much bigger. This time, it wasn't weakness. While Washington was busy talking, posturing, escalating rhetoric, something very different was happening behind the scenes in Canada. Quiet, methodical, step by step, move by move. The kind of strategy you don't notice until it's already too late. Here's the part that should make every American sit up and pay attention. Trump thought he was applying pressure, but in reality, he was walking straight into a trap. Think about that. If your opponent isn't fighting back, isn't arguing, isn't pushing back, are they really losing? Or are they just waiting for the right moment to flip the board? What came next didn't just catch the White House off guard, it changed the game completely. Here's where things take a turn most people never saw coming. While Washington was busy making noise, press conferences, threats, headlines, Mark Carney was doing the exact opposite. No drama, no chest thumping, just quiet, calculated execution. That silence wasn't hesitation. That was cover, because for nearly 3 months behind closed doors, far away from cameras, Canada was building something big. Not symbolic deals, not political theater, real, structural trade agreements with major global players. Europe, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and yes, even China. Now here's the part that should make you shake your head. Trump's team actually saw pieces of this happening. Reports came in, signals were there, early discussions were flagged, but they brushed it off, dismissed it as a bluff, a negotiating tactic, just Canada trying to gain leverage before eventually coming back to Washington. They didn't just underestimate Carney, they misread him completely because he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't buying time. He was building an entirely new system, a parallel trade network designed to function with far less dependence on the United States. And by the time Washington realized what was happening, it was already too late. Then came the moment everything flipped. Just days ago, Canada rolled it all out at once, a coordinated wave of trade agreements, sweeping, strategic, fast-moving. Early estimates, these deals could reduce Canada's economic dependence on the United States by nearly 40% within just 2 years. 40%. Let that sink in. That's not a tweak. That's not a negotiation tactic. That's a full-scale shift in direction. That's Canada stepping out of America's shadow and doing it faster than anyone thought possible. And the impact, it's already hitting. Canadian lumber, something American construction companies have relied on for decades, is now being redirected to Asian markets. Here's the painful truth. Those buyers are paying more than many U.S. firms were willing to pay. So, America isn't just losing supply, it's getting outbid. Pharmaceuticals, same story. Canadian generic drugs used by millions of Americans are now getting preferential access to European markets under these new deals. Priority has shifted, and the United States, it's no longer first in line. And then there's energy. This is where it gets serious. Canadian oil and natural gas, long integrated into U.S. infrastructure, are now being locked into long-term contracts with overseas partners. Stable deals, predictable revenue, and most importantly, alternatives to the American market. You see what's happening here? This isn't retaliation. This isn't emotion. This is strategy at a level Washington didn't prepare for. Carney didn't take Trump's bait. He didn't walk into the tariff trap. He went around it completely. And by the time the White House looked up, the board had already changed. This is where the pain begins. because what looked like a bold move by Canada is now turning into something much more serious for the United States. Not theory, not speculation, real damage, measurable, expensive, the kind you can't spin away with a press conference. And when someone like Warren Buffett steps in and says, America is learning an expensive lesson, you pay attention. This isn't a politician chasing headlines. This is one of the most respected investors in American history, a man who's seen cycles, crises, bubbles, and knows exactly what happens when markets lose confidence. According to reports, Buffett didn't sugarcoat it. You break a long-standing trade relationship based on impulse. Without fully understanding the consequences, he said, the market will correct you. And that correction, we're already seeing it unfold. Start with construction. The U.S. construction sector is now projecting a 17% increase in material costs in the next fiscal quarter alone. 17%. That's not normal inflation. That's not seasonal fluctuation. That's a direct hit driven by Canadian lumber becoming harder to secure and significantly more expensive as it's redirected overseas. The auto industry, one of the pillars of American manufacturing, is starting to feel the squeeze. Canadian parts suppliers, once deeply tied to U.S. contracts, production toward Europe and Asia. Why? Because those deals are longer term, more stable, and frankly more attractive than what they're getting from the United States right now. Delays, shortages, rising costs, and eventually those costs land right on the shoulders of American consumers. Then there's pharmaceuticals. This one hits even closer to home. Canada produces a significant portion of the generic medications Americans rely on every single day. Now, under this new trade framework, those supplies are being prioritized differently. First for American consumers, then there's pharmaceuticals. This one hits even closer to home. Canada produces a significant portion of the generic medications Americans rely on every single day. Now, under this new trade framework, those supplies are being prioritized differently. First for domestic use, then for European partners. In American pharmacies, they're starting to feel the pressure. Certain medications are getting harder to source. Availability is tightening. For some patients, this isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. And then we get to energy, possibly the most underestimated mistake of all. Trump seemed to believe that energy independence meant America could just walk away from Canadian oil and natural gas. But that's not how infrastructure works. Pipelines, regional grids, especially in northern states like Michigan and Minnesota. These systems were built around Canadian integration. You don't just replace that overnight. Now, energy costs are rising, heating bills are climbing. As colder months approach, that pressure could get even worse because Canadian suppliers are now locked into long-term agreements elsewhere. Those commitments come first. Let that sink in. For years, the assumption was simple. Canada needed the United States. Now the reality is shifting, and America is the one feeling the squeeze. This is exactly what Buffett was warning about. Not just financial loss, but the breakdown of something far more valuable. Trust, reliability, stability. Once those are gone, they don't come back easy. And if you think this is just about money, you're about to see how fast it turns political. Because when real pain hits real people, it doesn't stay on spreadsheets, it moves, it spreads, it shows up in state capitals, in local businesses, in family budgets. Right now, that pressure is building inside the United States. States that depend heavily on Canadian trade are starting to push back, and not quietly. Governors in northern states like Michigan and Minnesota are raising alarms. They're dealing with rising energy costs, disrupted supply chains, and businesses suddenly facing uncertainty they never planned for. This isn't partisan talking points. These are local leaders staring at real consequences hitting their own economies in real time. Inside Washington, there are growing discussions on both sides of the aisle about limiting the president's power to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional approval. Think about